things were filmed. When the characters are inside the Matrix, you notice that the simulated world seems very sterile, and there's an intentional green tint to the movie. This green tint to the colour is only used when the characters are inside the Matrix, to distinguish between the simulated world and the real world. The world inside the Matrix looks very, I don't know how to describe it, it looked very plain and kind of sparse. I want to say bland. Everything seemed designed for its purpose and not for comfort. The green tint seemed to remind me of the way the old retro early PC screens had looked, with that green tint and that green text to them. When you pay attention, I think it becomes obvious that this simulation was designed by machines, but it is kind of subtle as well. It's really well done. And then the set designs for the real world are very different. Humanity now lives below the ground, and the characters in the movie travel around in hovercraft ships that look very dirty and very mechanical. So, where the Matrix looks very sterile and in order, the real world is quite the opposite. And then there's the characters' costumes. They look very old and too big, like they were probably hand-me-downs from someone else, and they look torn and ragged and dirty, as they would do in those circumstances. But when these characters plug themselves into the Matrix, they have like a subconscious image of how they want themselves to look, and they're always dressed very, like, snappy. And this is probably because of how they dress in the real world. They probably just want to feel the finer things when they're in the Matrix, which I thought was very clever as well. Now, in the first 40 minutes of the movie, Neo asks a lot of questions, as you can imagine he would after being pulled out of a dream world. Apparently, all the questions were for the viewers of the movie. The Wachowskis were worried that the moviegoers wouldn't understand the movie, so they filled it with loads of explanations, answers to Neo's questions. Which I'm sure, as you agree, was a very good thing. When I first saw this movie, I found it a little bit confusing. Although I enjoyed the hell out of it, I had to actually watch the movie a few times to get a greater understanding of what was going on. Unfortunately, I think in the second and third movies, this becomes even more confusing, and you need to watch them a few more times to understand what's going on. I think now looking back, the first movie is probably the easiest one to understand. Now, as we all know, The Matrix did extremely well, and of course, 2 sequels were immediately greenlit. These 2 movies completed Neo's story, but they were nowhere near as good as the first movie. But that isn't to say that they were all bad. In fact, some parts of the sequels were really enjoyable. But before we talk about the sequels, I think we need to talk about the Matrix tie-ins that also came out. That kind of fleshed out the story of the Matrix and informed us of parts of the story that were in between the movies that we didn't get to see in the movies. And so in 2003, an anthology of short films set in the Matrix universe was released on DVD, and it was called The Animatrix. The Animatrix is a compilation of 9 animated short films, 4 of which were written by the Wachowskis. The short films build a backstory to accompany the Matrix trilogy. In these various animated shorts, we get to see the initial war between the humans and the machines, which ultimately led to the human race being defeated and the Matrix being created. We also see some side stories which don't really have much to do within the main plot of the movie, but they are just like a nice little extra glimpse into the world of the Matrix. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll give you a little bit of a brief description for all these animated shorts that are on the Animatrix. I think it's important that we talk about them. Now, the first short is called The Final Flight of the Icarus, and this short is completely CGI. And I remember at the time I was completely blown away by this short when I first saw it in 2003. The only other CG movie I can think that rivaled this was the CGI movie Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, which was released in 2001. Now, at this time, there weren't that many CGI movies that had been created that convincingly shown human features. I mean, you just look back at the first Toy Story film that was made, you never really saw the human faces apart from maybe Andy and Sid, and they looked terrible when you look back, they looked awful. I'd say Final Fantasy movie, this was probably the turning point. And it wasn't perfect yet, but we were on our way. We were definitely on our way. And at the time, as I said, I remember it just blew me away, and they had actually created quite convincing CGI human beings. And actually, as I did further research into this first Animatrix short, I actually learned that it was the same company that did the Final Fantasy movie that actually made this short. The company was called Square Pictures. The first scene, we are introduced to a man and a woman who are having a blindfolded sword fight in a dojo, a simulated dojo, like in the first Matrix movie where Morpheus is showing Neo all the tricks of the Matrix and training him how to fight in the Matrix. The couple then proceed to slice each other's clothing off. It's a bit raunchy and you get the feeling that they are in some kind of relationship. It's kind of like a flirtatious scene. They're kind of slicing each other's clothes away and you start to see the actual bodies underneath the clothing, and it is quite impressive for that time. Like I said, the CGI was really well done, and it was almost like a tech demo just to show what the technology could do, that you could see the pores in the skin and the muscles underneath the skin and the veins underneath the skin. It was more or less like a tech demo, and it was very impressive at the time. In the next scene, after the simulation, the two return to the crew on board the other craft, the Icarus, and they discover that there is an army of sentinels, and after destroying a small group of the killer robots, the ship then goes above the surface and discovers that the machines are drilling above Zion, the last underground city where the human race live. They are spotted by some sentinels, and the ship flees whilst being pursued. Now, it's at this point that the crew know that they're not going to escape from the sentinels, and the woman from the beginning enters the Matrix to send a message out about the drilling. Now, once she's in the Matrix, she only has a limited amount of time before the sentinels destroy the ship. So she has to get this message to like this post box. I suppose it's like a drop-off point where other parts of the resistance can collect their messages from. So after a lot of jumping through windows and jumping off rooftops and over rooftops and getting around all these obstacles, she eventually delivers a message. And then in the real world, the Sentinels catch up to the hover ship and it explodes. And then you flip back to the Matrix and you see the woman drop to the floor dead. Now, when you watch the movie, The Matrix Reloaded, they actually mention the ship, the Icarus, and the message that was delivered by them. And that is actually how they know that the machines are tunneling down to Zion. But if we hadn't seen the Animatrix, then we would never have known how that story unfolded with them getting the message to that postbox, which is a nice little bit of a filler. And I think it's kind of cool how we actually got to see that part of the story in the animated short. And then we had the short called The Second Resistance Part 1. This tells us a story where the human race have created sentient AI, and the robots are now more or less our slaves, and they are used to do everyday jobs. The androids look human-like, and they are built in our image. In one scene, we see CCTV footage of a domestic house servant android turn against its owners, killing them. The pets and a mechanic who was instructed to deactivate the android. Later on, we see that android in a court trial. The android states that he was acting in self-defense and it did not want to die. Now, I've got to say, the scene where you see the android kill the human beings is very graphic. One scene shows the android's hands crushing the face of its owner. It's disgusting. You see the brain pop out and everything in the eyeballs. It is very disgusting and shocking. The android is sentenced to death, and that's when they start to get an uprising, and some of the other androids start to protest, accompanied by some human sympathizers as well. Now, fearing the war, the government start to destroy all androids, and the way this is animated is also very graphic, just like the last scene I just spoke about where the android squashed the owner's head. There's another scene that comes to mind which is actually quite hard to watch. The scene that I'm talking about is that of a female having her clothing ripped off by a gang of men. The clothing is being ripped from her body and you see her breasts and her burst skin, and then she is brutally smashed over the head, ripping the skin from her face, revealing that she is actually a robot. You see all these robotics inside her head where she's just been smashed open. As they are smashing her on the head, she is screaming that she is real in like a broken machine voice. She's screaming she's real, she don't want to die. And then they shoot her through the back with a shotgun. It's very graphic and very shocking, and that image did actually stick in my mind when I first watched this Animatrix. I think it was a bit OTT. It does show the ugliness of the human race, and at first you think she's a human being, and then you discover, oh no, she's a machine, but you still feel sorry for it. Anyway, after this scene, some of the robots flee and they are allowed to build their own nation. The androids start to create highly advanced artificial intelligence, which affect the profits of the human economy. Because the androids are creating this technology which is just way more superior than anything the humans can create. And they're selling it to the humans and it's taking all the money away from the rest of the world, whilst this nation of AI robots prosper. And of course the government don't like this. So there's actually a part 2 to this animated short, and in part 2 we see the government send a nuclear attack to the androids' own nation. The surviving androids wage war on the human race, and it becomes clear that the machines may actually win, so the humans launch Operation Darkstorm, which blacks out the sky and deprives the machines from solar energy. This was mentioned in the first Matrix movie when Morpheus is telling Neo about the machine uprising. So with the creation of better killing machines, the androids eventually win the war and start to use humans' race as a power supply, and they create their Matrix and plug all the humans into them and start actually birthing human beings to actually go into these pods and sustain them. Now the next short is called Kid Story. Now if you remember in The Matrix Reloaded, when Neo returns to Zion, he is greeted by an eager young man who seems to want to show his gratitude for saving him from the Matrix. Well, this short tells us how that came about. 6 months between the end of the first movie and the beginning of the second movie. So that's quite an interesting little plot filler that we got in the Animatrix that filled in a few gaps in the movie. The next short is called Program. In this short we see two friends, a woman named Sis and a man named Duo. Sis and Duo are both jacked into a training simulation set in ancient Japan. As they are dueling in their training program, Duo reveals that he wants to go back into the Matrix and he wants her to come with him. The fight becomes intensified as she is trying her best to get out of the simulation, but no one is listening to her cries. The fight goes on and it gets more brutal, and then he informs her that the decision has already been made. He's already made his mind up that he's going back into the Matrix, and he sent a message to the Sentinels who are coming right now to destroy the ship. The sword fight continues, and eventually Sis then kills her friend and is logged out of the simulation, only to find it was all a cruel training program. Now, I must admit, I did enjoy that animated short. It was a bit brutal, but I did enjoy it. The next short is called World Record. This short tells the story of a track athlete who is competing in a 100-metre race. After being disqualified last time, he decides to race again to break his record. Whilst running in the race, his muscles in his legs seem to violently burst and explode. And then we discover that 4 agents are actually witnessing the race. Regardless, he runs even faster. Because of this explosion of willpower and defiance, he actually awakes from the Matrix and wakes up in his pod. And it's actually cool how it's animated. It's like he's actually still trying to run when he wakes up in the pod and he's trying to break loose. But as quickly as it happens, one of the AI in the real world grabs him and actually connects him back into the Matrix, and as he snaps back into the Matrix, he actually collapses and falls past the finish line. So he actually does break his own record. In the next scene, he is seen in a wheelchair, crippled. An agent tells another agent that the athlete will never walk again. But nevertheless, the athlete does try to stand, and he almost does before falling down again, which suggests that the athlete's willpower is strong, and that's why the agents have been watching him to make sure that he doesn't realise that he's living a lie. The next short is called Beyond. In this short, we see a girl looking for a pet cat, and she runs into a group of young boys who tell her that the cat was inside a nearby haunted house where they play. The haunted house is actually a house that contains computer glitches in the Matrix, and in certain areas seems to defy the laws of physics, giving the impression of the supernatural. Whilst looking for a cat, she sees broken light bulbs that flicker in and out of existence, rain falling from a sunny sky, and shadows that don't really align with anything, and parts of the area where gravity does simply not apply. Eventually, agents become aware of this anomaly in the Matrix, and they appear in the form of rat exterminators or something like that. The next day, the kids return to find that there is no haunted house, and it's been replaced with a car park. And they are led to believe that all this happened over the course of a day, and now the glitches in the Matrix have all seemingly been fixed. The next short is called Detective Story. This is set in a film noir world about a PI who is looking for a hacker. The hacker is named Trinity. This plays as a direct prequel to the original movie. It's set in a strange steampunk world. It's strange. It's almost like it's set in the 1950s. And some of the technology looks old, but when the technology is actually working, it is very advanced. It's strange. It's like it's almost not set in the actual modern world of the Matrix, like it's set in the 1950s, but at the same time, it is meant to be set in the same timeline as the films. It is a strange one. Whilst investigating, he realises that many other detectives have tried but fail to find Trinity, and they've all gone mad in the process. After following a few clues, he finally tracks down